Hey, I'm Brandon. Welcome back to Flyin Miata. Today we're going to be installing our coolant reroute on this turbo NB. All right, so we've got all of our parts laid out. This is the reroute kit right here. So you've got instructions, hose, gaskets, block off plates, all of your hardware, bleeder screw and all that fun stuff. Nice stant thermostat, and then of course the centerpiece, the reroute itself. And then this is the turbo connection kit right here. So basically just a whole bunch of high quality silicone hose, the heat sleeve. This is the same stuff we use on our turbo kit, really high quality stuff. It lasts a long time. P-clamps to hold everything in place, replacement hose clamps, hose barbs, new crush washers for the turbo, and then some hardware here to hold everything in place. So we'll get to all of this as we go through the install. Job number one, believe it or not, drain the coolant. So every radiator is a little bit different. Our crossflow radiators have the drain on the side, on the underside obviously. Usually stock radiators and upright downflow radiators with the tanks on the top and bottom have it in the middle. Hopefully you can figure that out. Drain it, remove the cap to make it drain a little bit faster. And there you go. Make sure that you collect it and you're safe. All that fun stuff. If it's brand new and clean, reuse it. If it's not, you can put new stuff in, but we'll talk about that later. So we need to remove this brake booster line right here, the pipe. It gets in the way because we're going to be working back here. So we're going to take that off first. First things, before you remove the pipe, remove the things that are attached to the pipe. So we're going to remove the hoses here. And you got a spring clamp. Lots of times the rubber will kind of get seized. That one actually was not bad. And then just pull down. Okay. I'm going to pop the throttle cable out as well, because I want to be able to remove it all together. The later cars like this have a wiring harness up here. You want to pinch these two pieces together so that they can slip out of this hose, or excuse me, hole. As you saw, pretty easy. Needle nose make it a little bit easier to get down in there, so I'll probably come back at that in a sec with some needle nose. Get this guy off here. There you go. You can hear how it kind of let go. And work it off, and there you go. So that's off, and then, so we've got a vacuum line here. This is an aftermarket one, so rather than cut all those zip ties, I'll just pull it out like this. Anytime you disconnect anything, make absolutely sure that you know where it came off of, and you can put it back on there. This would probably be easier to just cut off. So 10mm socket to get these guys off. Try not to drop your hardware, that's always annoying. Always goes to the deepest, darkest corner of your engine bay. So now we're gonna work on the back of the engine here. Job number one is to basically get everything stripped off so that we can install the new reroute. It's really difficult to see this back here, so we're going to work on that engine on the stand just to show you guys what we're doing here. The first thing we need to do is get a little bit of penetrant on the EGR pipe. So we need to remove the EGR pipe in specific situations to allow the reroute to get into place. Basically the thermostat sticks out of the back of the reroute, so we need that distance. So if your car is a US 1.6, a 90 to 93, it does not have an EGR. If you have a standalone ECU in the car, you probably won't have the EGR pipe, I should say. And if you have a 94 to 97 Miata with one of our turbo kits and one of our EGR pipes on it, you shouldn't need to remove the EGR pipe. We've got a little bit more clearance on that EGR pipe. So assuming you don't have one of those and you do need to, basically this nut over here can get seized up. So it's a good idea to spray some penetrant on there to start off with. Depending on your specific year and all that fun stuff, you may have a nut here, you may have more of a bolt here coming off of your number 4 runner, or you may have a nut coming off of number 3 right here. So either way, whatever you have, you'll need to hit that with some penetrant. If you still have a stock exhaust manifold, you're probably going to have a stock heat shield on it. So you'll need to remove all the nuts holding it in place before you'll have access to the EGR. So these nuts, these bolts might also be a little seized, so penetrant is not a bad idea there. But anyway, get that done. It's a good idea to let the penetrant kind of soak and do its thing for a little while before you try to take it off. The intake side of the EGR pipe, it's really unlikely you're going to have any corrosion there. It's not going to hurt anything to hit it with penetrant, but it's much less critical for you to hit that. Okay, so I wanted to give you guys a run through of what I'm going to do real quick. It's really hard to see stuff, as you can imagine, when it's all tucked in behind the in front of the firewall there. Plus, there are differences in different cars. So this was a 2001, so it doesn't have coils on the back of the head. It's got coils on the plugs. So it's one less thing to worry about on that car. Most of the cars do have these coils to worry about. So you need to take the coil pack off. That means disconnecting the spark plug wires. Make sure that you know the firing order here. The easiest thing that I find is just take a picture of it. So that way when you're putting it all back together, you can just follow the picture, easy. So you've got these 2 plugs that need to be undone. You should be able to get to these. There's a tab right there. It can be a little grumpy sometimes, but push that tab in, pull the whole thing up. So when you take these guys off, be careful. If it's not coming, don't force it. You might want to use needle nose or pliers to push this tab in. Sometimes it doesn't completely release from the plastic tower. So get those guys off. You're probably not going to be able to get this temp sensor back here unplugged until these coils are out of the way. So you want to take bolt, bolt, bolt off. These 2 are a piece of cake. This one's a little bit of a pain. So these are 12mm heads here. This guy's a bit of a bear to get access to. I don't really see it as being very critical, so if you don't want to put it back in, don't put it back in. We're going to take the EGR pipe off. Like I talked about earlier, now it's been soaking with penetrant, so take it off here or thereabouts, depending on your year. They all look the same over here. There is another tab. This one's actually broken off, which is pretty frequent, pretty likely. But this tab is another one that's kind of a bear to get to. So you want to take that off, and that'll allow you to at least kind of move the EGR pipe back. Once you've got the coil out of the way, take the ECU temp sensor off. These will look a little bit different between different years, but similar. And then bolt, nut, and then this guy comes off. We are gonna leave this stud in place. We reuse that. So don't worry about taking that stud out, just leave it as is. So I've already loosened these, as you can tell. My hands aren't actually that strong. All right, we'll pull this housing off real quick. I've already cleaned up this surface a bit. This isn't the engine we're actually going to put it on, but you want to make sure, and this is kind of difficult to do with it buried in the car, but you want to make sure to clean up this surface, get all the remnants of the old gasket off so that it's going to seal up nicely with the new gasket. You also want to take this sensor out of the housing. This one, again, we've kind of set things up a little bit here, so that guy, and we're not going to use this housing. Okay, so we need to get the heater core outlet off the back of the head here. Pretty tight back here, so it can be a little bit of a headache. The other thing that's a little annoying on this car is that the 2 tabs of the spring clamp, or one of them rather, is perfectly oriented with the EGR pipe. So that means I can't really get on it from the top. So I'm just going to take that whole housing out, and then I'm going to take the heater core hose off. One important note, if you are replacing the heater core hoses, don't pull them off of the heater core itself right here. You want to take the spring clamps off, cut the hose. You know, don't go crazy with it. You don't want to cut through the soft metal, but you want to cut the hose and then take the hose off. If you try to pull the hose off, it is possible for you to actually damage the really soft metal of the heater core, and then your hose replacement job just became a tear the dash out and replace the heater core job. So we're going to try to avoid that. This car has pretty new heater hoses, so we don't need to worry about it, just something to bear in mind. You'll likely lose a little bit of coolant here, even if you drain the system. It's kind of impossible to get it completely empty. A little better access to it here. Come on. Yeah, so that's, lots of times you'll get the rubber bonded to the aluminum. It really doesn't like to come off, so you got to kind of force it. Oh man, there you go. That one was really stuck on there. All right, there we go. We got it out. So now we're going to take this sensor out of this housing. All right, so we're not going to reuse this housing, but we are going to reuse this sensor. Now we do, you can see there's a crush washer on there to start off with. You might be okay reusing it, but we've got a new one in the kit, so be sure to put that guy on there. It's time for some new parts. So we're going to put the thermostat into the reroute first. You can see, because of the shape of the reroute in there, this bar will interfere if we try to put it in like that. So you want that bar to be roughly horizontal, or excuse me, roughly parallel with this surface. So we put it in there, and you can kind of rotate it, and you can see how it picks up when I rotate it too far, but there's plenty of room in there to get it properly seated. So get that guy pressed down into place, reasonably tight fit. Take your retaining ring here, and basically you just want to make it so that the opening isn't over here where there's no lip for it to hold on to, and you want to make it so that it's not over the bleed hole. That part's a little less critical, but so just slip it into place. There's a little groove in there for it. You can kind of push it in most of the way with your fingers. You may or may not need a screwdriver to get it in, but there you go. That's in place. Now, when you need to take it out, not for a long time, but just FYI, there's a little groove right there. You can get a screwdriver in there, and then it comes right back out. No big deal. So that's how we get the thermostat in. That's solid. So now we need to put a gasket on it. So this scenario is a little unique. You want to make sure this surface is nice and clean. You know, no fluids or anything. There is adhesive on the back side of this, so we want to make sure that it's actually going to stick. So we take that wax paper off. Usually there's a little tab on there like that. It probably just fell off of this one. Almost. All right, there we go. So we want to carefully pull that off. And then you kind of only get one shot of this. It's not crazy adhesive, but still. So carefully place it using the holes for the bolts as guides. So place it down into place like that. You can see it's about concentric over here. It's a little closer over here, but that'll get the job done. So push it down into place. Now here's what you need to do in order to make it fully functional. So you can take a screwdriver if you'd like, but you want to basically push down on the gasket so that the gasket will show you where the edge of the metal is, because we're going to trim this gasket so that you get appropriate water flow through everything, but you don't know where to trim it. So by pushing it down, kind of use your finger, use the screwdriver, you can create a template for yourself that way. Be careful not to gouge any of the sealing surfaces of the gasket. Also, make sure to get the bleed hole up here. You can kind of, it's dead vertical, but you can kind of feel it. Theoretically, that one's a little harder to get to. There we go. So that's it right there. When you cut the gasket, you want to make sure to use a brand new razor blade. It's, in my experience, really important. If you use a not brand new blade, you're probably going to tear the gasket more than you're going to actually cut it. So we're going to just cut along the line that we've created there. Try to hold the blade pretty parallel to the surface if you can. And it doesn't need to be perfect, so we can kind of make it work. Okay, but make sure that it doesn't tear out any of that other sealing surface, because obviously that's pretty important. Okay, and then I'll cut a little slot here. This one's a little harder to get pretty, but really in here, pretty is not real critical. As long as you don't have big flaps and as long as you're not creating a leak, you should be good to go. So. Okay, and then last guy right here, this one is slotted. So we want to slot the gasket as well so that we can just drop it straight down into place. So there you go, sealed up, just like that. So now we need to basically fill all of these holes. We need to put all the sensors and the plugs and whatever else in there. So it doesn't really make a huge difference what you start with. This one's in front of me, so I'll do it. Use it. This is, again, the stock temp sensor. This is for the ECU. And I have the new crush washer on there because these are straight threads. I'll talk about the other threads in just a sec. So we're gonna slip that on there, just like that. A little tight to get the wrench in there, but you can get it and get that snug. It doesn't need to be crazy, but it needs to be snug. So that guy's in there. We'll do this one next. So this is your bleeder screw. So these are tapered threads. So the tapered threads means that that's kind of an angle. This diameter is smaller than this diameter, which means that it's not going to visibly bottom out. And I'll show you that in a second. But the other part of that is that you do need thread paste on there. Some of these fittings already have thread paste pre-installed, some don't. When you see the red like that, that's your thread paste. It's already on there. You don't need to put more on. When you see, let me show you this one. When you see bare threads, obviously they're bare, no thread paste. So we'll put the bleeder in there. Now another thing to point out, this brass piece is what gets tightened into here. This black piece, just like your brakes, if you bled your brakes, if you have Wilwood brakes, literally the same thing, this is what allows for the bleeding. So this gets tight and then doesn't get loosened again. This gets tightened up when you're done bleeding the system. So you can leave this guy open for now, but we're gonna put this in. All right, so I'm gonna thread this guy in by hand until I can't anymore. The thread paste is gonna keep me from being able to thread it in. This one is a 12 millimeter, go figure. So we're gonna get that snug. NPT threads are a little bit of a subjective thing. You don't wanna get them crazy tight, but you wanna get them snug, because basically what you're doing is you're making the threads deform to each other, which is how they're supposed to work, but there's such a thing as going too far. So just get it nice and snug. The official torque spec is 1.5 to 3 turns past hand tight. When they're kind of preloaded with the thread sealant, hand tight is a little bit of a vague thing, but so on this one, it will be less of a vague thing. So this is going to be your barb for the heater core. Obviously it goes in the big hole there. So we're going to get a bit of thread sealant on there. Don't need a ton. but you want to make sure you get it on so that it's going to distribute throughout the grooves of the threads. Thread that guy in there, and then we will tighten him down. And again, you basically just kind of subjective, you know, you don't have to go crazy on it. I'm not going to put this in a vise to go bonkers, but it's pretty snug. The remaining holes here, this hole is for a temp sensor. If you have an aftermarket coolant temp gauge, you can drop it in there. If you have something else you want to plug in that's 1/8 NPT, go for it. These two are for turbo feed and turbo return. So the kit comes with these plugs. Well, 3 of these plugs are for this piece. So these plugs to plug this hole, these holes. If you're going to put something else in there, obviously don't use the plugs. So I'm going to put this in here because we don't have an aftermarket temp sensor. So since this is a turbo install, we're going to put the hose barbs into these 2 fittings. That means that we're not going to use all of the plugs. Basically, you'll still use one here, assuming you don't have an aftermarket temp gauge. You'll use one probably on the front plate, but you'll have 2 of those plugs left over. So we're going to put some goop on these guys. We do prefer thread paste as opposed to thread tape. Thread tape will work fine in a coolant system. Never use it in an oil system, but still, I'm kind of partial to paste. Seems to seal really well, and more importantly, little tails won't break off and float into to plug things up. So get these tightened down. Again, go by hand to start off with. And then official torque spec, again, 1.5 to 3 turns past hand tight. For me, it's kind of snug, which don't go crazy. This is not a place to show off how strong you are. You just want it snug. This is a good example of NPT threads. So again, they're tapered. The threads, the male thread bottoms out on the female thread. It's not that the head of the bolt bottoms out on the bottom, on what it's being tightened into. So you can see that this fitting is a little bit closer to the surface than this fitting. That's fine. That's just a matter of a little bit different tap depth. No problem. As long as you get it snug and the majority of the threads are in there, it'll still seal up fine. So put this bolt back in there. We'll start here just to show you guys how it fits in kind of a real world situation where you can actually see stuff. So anyway, put that nut on a couple turns. You want to slip this slotted piece down onto that stud and then roll that into place. It'll be more difficult behind the engine, but it's really not too bad, or in the car rather. And then tighten these guys. I'm not going to bother to get them tight since we're going to pull it right back off, but 14 to 18 pound-feet on those guys. So just to show you how it fits here with the coils, we'll put these in real quick. Actually, I'll tell you what, let me show you something first. Maybe, there we go. So on this, you can see that this metal piece doesn't come together. This bolt is a royal pain to get to, and it really doesn't serve a whole lot of purpose. It'll work just fine with the 2 bolts on top. So you can skip it altogether, or you can push this sleeve out, pull this guy out. It's easier said than done, so I'm not going to waste your time with that. But then slot this hole, because it's right now, it's not complete on the bottom, but it comes around enough so that this won't come out. If you slot that hole, and then you can just bolt this grommet and the sleeve and everything into place, and then just slide the coil down onto it. That allows you to retain that 3rd bolt, but it makes installation and removal dramatically easier. So let's drop this guy into place right there. Again, this is not something we're going to be doing on our actual car because it doesn't have these coils, but you can see how everything fits. Couple things right here. This bolt is long, and this is actually a shorter one than what your car probably has. So it's actually going to block the bleeder. So you want to pull this guy out and put this guy in. Makes adjusting the timing a little more complicated. That's not a thing that happens very frequently, so it shouldn't be an issue, but it gives you much better access to the bleeder, and that's pretty important. So the other thing to note is that you don't want to plug the ECU temp sensor in until the coils are in place, and this last guy is bolted down if you choose to use that, because the plug will block access to that bolt. So if you're going to use this bolt, you want to make sure to plug this guy in after that bolt is in place. So all that having been said, we'll tear this back off and we'll put it into the car where it's actually going to live. So we're going to drop this guy into place now. It's a tight space back there, so it's a little weird getting it in place. You'll kind of finesse it into place. On this particular car, and your car might be different, if it's if it's an earlier car that doesn't have the VVT oil feed here, it might be easier to drop it in this way. On this one, I'm just going to bring it in through the side like this and kind of drop it down like so, and slip it. Make sure the slotted part on the bottom drops down onto that stud. You can kind of roll it sideways around that stud while pushing in on the long bolt until you get until it starts to thread in. So once it starts to thread in, you're good to go. So we will tighten those guys again to 14 to 18 pound-feet or snug. Some things are really critical on torque. This is not one of them, but if you need something to aim for, that's your number. I'm going to say that is roughly 14 to 18 pound-feet. So let's get in here and get, actually, you know what, a socket is going to make my life easier there. And also I can spin it in a fair ways by hand. Okay. So I actually have a pretty good view of it right here. So for what it's worth, you'll be able to see it reasonably well over here. All right, and there we go. We're gonna put the EGR pipe in now. The one for this car is still in there. We're just gonna kind of pull it back up into place, thread it on both sides, and move on. High temp anti-seize on the exhaust side is a pretty good idea. Sometimes they go really easily, sometimes they're a little bit of a headache. If you're having trouble with them, make sure you're putting it on square. Don't put one side on completely and then try to get the other side on, because that's probably not going to work. If you want to put one side on before the other, I would put the intake side on and then the exhaust side. But again, try to put it on as square as possible. It's a doable thing. It'll work. Came off, it can go back on. But sometimes they're a little bit of a headache. So just something to be prepared for. So we'll go ahead and get this guy wrapped up. All right, got some anti-seize on the threads there. So I do have it started on both sides. Actually, excuse me, let me put the nuts on the intake side just loosely, just enough to make sure that nothing's gonna come off while I am futzing with the exhaust side. Yeah, so the threads can be a little gummy. Just kind of part of it. It'll work, just takes a bunch of turns. Sometimes you can contort your hand to the right position so that you can actually thread it in by hand, which goes definitely much more quickly than quarter turn at a time. Quarter turn if you're lucky, really. I got lucky that time. I got myself pretty close just doing it hand tight. There we go. All right, that side's tight. Okay. Okay, and the EGR pipe is on. So we're gonna hook the heater core hose up now. So I kind of had that tucked away. Let me pull that back out. All right, so I still have that spring hose clamp on there. The brass hose barb is slightly smaller in diameter, so you can't use the spring clamp. Be careful with these. Make sure your pliers have a really good grip on those tabs, and when you release it slowly. and make sure your fingers aren't anywhere where they're going to be pinched. Also, if it just slips off the side, they can rocket a spectacularly far distance, and hopefully not into your eyeball or anything dramatic like that. So you do want to be careful there. So I'm going to orient this so that I've got easy access to that piece, and then slide it on to the hose barb. All right, that's on. And then we'll run her down with this guy. All right, so make sure it's nice and snug. Try to do it the last bit by hand so you don't strip out the worm gear on there. All right, so that looks pretty good to me. Time to work on the front of the car now. So we need to take the upper radiator hose off, the thermostat housing, the thermostat itself, and then we will seal this up and we'll work on running our upper radiator hose from the back of the head now up to the radiator here. We do have the option to remove this neck altogether. So our kind of standard setup is remove the housing and leave the neck, but you can, we do include the pieces to remove the neck if you want. Now, if you want to do that, that's a fair amount of effort for basically just aesthetic purposes. So we're not going to cover that in the video. The really short version is take the valve cover off, take this timing belt cover off, take the cam gears off, slip the timing belt off, then take the cam gears off. There's a plate behind there that needs to come off. 2 bolts that hold this guy in, take it off, bolt our plate back on, comes with the O-ring you need and all that fun stuff, and then reassemble. Bear in mind that on a naturally aspirated car, you've got a hose that runs from the water pump down here to the water neck, and then from the water neck over to the idle air control valve. If you remove this water neck, you're not going to have that piece to connect it to. So you're going to need to run a hose from the water pump all the way over to the idle air control valve. We don't include that length of hose because that's kind of a non-standard way to do it. If you want to, no problem. And with the turbo connection kit, we do include enough hose for you to run it that way if you'd like. So all of that having been said, let's get to work. Again, spring clamps over here. We'll just work this guy off. It can be a little grumpy. Okay, and I'm not going to bother to take this guy off because we're removing the housing anyway. There's no real reason to. Okay, so I've got that loose. I'm going to pull this guy off. So you've got a nut on the bottom and a bolt on the top, similar to the back of the head. Okay. Pull that guy off there. And then we will get this out of the way. So the thermostat is kind of held in place by the gasket. So just try to peel the gasket off as well as you can. If it comes off in one piece, that's that much less that you have to clean up. So there's definitely some fuzz there for me to clean up, but it's not too bad. So you can see it a little better. This is basically what I was doing, mostly by braille, in the back. So you want to be careful if you're using a razor blade. Be careful that you don't gouge the aluminum. You don't want to create leaks that weren't there before. So try to keep the blade square to the surface. Don't go in at too steep of an angle because you're gonna kind of gouge in a little bit, and just generally be careful. Better to take your time, do it slowly, than to kind of rush in. Okay, so I can feel there's a little bit of adhesive left on that. So I'm going to use a little bit of brake cleaner just to clean that off. All right, so that should be good. We've got this bare and clean now. We need to take this stud out. That shoulder is a little bit thick for the plate that we're going to put on. So there's what we call a double nut method to get it off. So you want to thread one nut on, thread another nut on, and then you're going to tighten those two against each other. Now it's a 13 millimeter size on that. 13 millimeter is almost exactly the same as a 1/2 inch. So if you only have one set of wrenches, but you have a metric and an English set, there you go, you're well equipped. So again, I'm tightening those two nuts against each other, not against anything on the stud. And then I'm going to use the bottom nut to take that off. All right, so that is removed. You're not going to use these nuts for anything else. We include these nuts, but that is their one and only purpose. Take the thermostat gasket. This one actually does have its tab, so the paper comes off nice and easy. Push those little holes out, and we will just glue that. I've already cleaned it off. Glue that on there, and really the adhesive is less for sealing and more for installation ease, just to make it so that it'll stay in place while you're putting your parts in. You don't have to worry about it falling out. We're going to take our plate, we're going to put that into place. Okay, so 13 millimeter again on here. Okay, again, technically 14 to 18 pound-feet, but snug. If this were in the US a 1.6, but a 90 to 93, then we would use this big hole for the fan switch. So on the stock setup, the thermostat is oriented this direction instead of this direction, and there's a sensor that goes straight down. That sensor is to turn your fan on, so it needs to be reused unless you have some kind of other control. If you don't know what I'm talking about, reuse the sensor. If you do know what I'm talking about, you're good to go. So on an earlier car, you would thread that in there. This is not an earlier car. We have no use for that hole. So we have a plug and a crush washer. Both of these included in the kit. You want to make sure to use those guys and put them in, and I will tighten that up in just a second. This other hole is for a temp sensor. So same deal as the back. We're going to use another one of those 1/8 NPT plugs there because we don't have a temp sensor we're putting in this car. Tighten that guy up. And again, 1.5 to 3 turns past hand tight. A little bit of a qualifier on there with a thread paste, but just don't go crazy on it. So this guy is a straight thread. It is not a tapered thread. So you do want to tighten that down until it bottoms out. Bear in mind you are tightening into aluminum here, and that's a big enough, that's 24. So it's a big enough wrench that you're going to have a lot of leverage. Don't go crazy, don't strip it. So we do need to reuse both of these clamps. So I'm going to take them off real quick. Get our new hose here. Hose is pretty long. You'll need to cut some off. That's on purpose. Wanted to make sure we'd rather have it too long than too short. So I'm going to put this hose clamp on to start off with, and I'm going to slip it down a ways, not real far, but a little bit, so that I can slip it onto the reroute without having to kind of worry about how it's going to fit. So that'll go to a normal shape once it's out of its bag for a while. Making sure you get the right routing here is a little difficult, and every car is a little different. So I can't give you a, do it exactly this way kind of setup. Generally speaking, try to weave it around so that it's not going to rub on anything sharp. It's not going to be kinked, anything like that. So I'm gonna route it here, and we'll see if this is good for this car. And I could just work it on there. Okay, it is a good idea to kind of pay attention to your hose clamp orientation, which I didn't do. So try to make sure that you get it in a place that is easily accessible. Mine is accessible, but not easily. So not too difficult of a problem to solve there, fortunately. Push it on as far as you can. Really, that's going to be your best bet. All right, so, okay, I'm going to look at this and see what I think here. I think I want this guy routed underneath this hose instead of on top. So let me pull it back out here. This charcoal canister on NBs slides in and out pretty easily, so I'll just leave that out until I get it oriented properly. Okay, so you want to make sure it's not too short, which pulls it into things. And you want to make sure it's not too long and making it crimp. It's kind of a balancing act. So this looks pretty good right here. I'm concerned about this spot over here. There's a little bracket that's going to poke down, and I'm concerned about this metal piece right here. So what I'm going to do is cut the hose to length, install it on the radiator, and then use my excess to kind of buffer that to make sure that nothing rubs through. A trick for cutting hose, now if you've got a hose cutter like we do, easy, no big deal. If you don't, wrap a piece of masking tape, not electrical tape because it's stretchy, but a piece of masking tape around there. You can line up the edges and that gives you a straight line to cut to, and you just cut along the masking tape. So that just gives, you don't have to, makes it look a little bit nicer because it gives you a nice clean, straight edge as opposed to some kind of hacked up thing. So probably don't need to tell anybody, but it's a whole lot easier to cut more off than it is to add more back on. So cut it a little long to start off with, and then work your way into the right length. So let's see what that looks like. And I think, as expected, that is just a hair long. So I will trim a little more off. And I think we'll be pretty good after this, so I'll go ahead and put that hose clamp on there. Okay, so I'm gonna get my hose clamp set up so that I'm ready to put it onto the hose. It's easiest if you use a set of vice grips, so they're locking, so they will lock the hose clamp open. My vice grips don't have enough throw to get it, so I kind of have to double up on the pliers. There's a lot of tension there. There's a lot of potential energy if you want to play nerd. Be very careful with that. All right, and now that's locked in place and it's a little bit safer. So we're gonna slip this on, and it's a pretty tight fit by the time you put it over there. So I'm gonna put the hose clamp where I want it to be on the hose ultimately, and then I'm gonna slide it on as one assembly. A little bit of a pain, but it is a doable thing. I'm gonna come around here so I can just pull towards me, and I'm gonna work it on all the way, and then kind of feel for the bead on the barb there. Once it's on there, it's not falling off on the inside. You can carefully release your vice grips and you're good to go. So that's connected. You're going to use the same method in the back to get that connected. Now this car is using our cross-flow radiator, so it works out, I mean, you can see the routing works out really well with how the hose comes in here. If you still have a stock radiator, you should probably buy our cross-flow radiator. But if you want to stick with it, the inlet is kind of here, so it's going to be a bit of an exercise to get it connected. Every car is different depending on what kind of intake you have. All that kind of stuff is going to come into the equation. So basically, route it cleanly, make sure it doesn't end up on anything sharp, make sure that nothing's going to chafe or wear through, that kind of thing. What I'm going to do now, we've routed this down so it's low, it fits pretty well, it's not hitting anything sharp. It is rubbing against this AC line here, and it is rubbing against the intake manifold as well right there. So I'm going to cut a piece of our leftover hose that is roughly that length. So I'm going to cut it, and I'm going to use it as a buffer. So, okay, and then I'm just going to slit it. Otherwise, obviously, it won't fit on. Try to make it a little square, although it's going to be hidden from view. So, and now I can slip this on, and it's going to be protection for the hose. If we were designing a car from the ground up, we wouldn't have to do this kind of thing. We're not. We're working with what Mazda did for us. So right there. So now it's going to wear on this, which is kind of sacrificial, and honestly you probably won't see that much wear, but obviously you don't want to wear on the radiator hose itself. So there you go. We're good everywhere else. Make sure, again, check really thoroughly. Make sure that there's no sharp points, particularly these spring clamps. They have those tabs there. If you've got one that's oriented in the wrong direction, it might rub, and that will cut through the hose pretty quickly. There's a pretty easy solution to that. Typically, you just rotate it around so that the tabs aren't hitting that. So now that we've got the upper radiator hose done, we're going to move on to the turbo side of things. So I'm going to go over installing this kit on a car that has a Flyin Miata turbo kit on it. If you have a different turbo kit, it's going to be really similar, but some of the specifics might be a little bit different. So you'll have to problem solve your way around that. Shouldn't be a big issue. If you have problems, as always, just give us a call. All of that having been said, we're going to take this guy off first so we have access to everything. So we got one bolt back here. On our newer kits, well, newer within the last probably 5 years actually, we've actually put a slot back there so you don't have to remove that bolt altogether. You got to remove this one completely, and of course the bolt holding it in place right here. Try to make sure you don't drop anything. It's always fun chasing bolts. Anybody that's worked on a car for more than 30 seconds has known that joy. There is a ground, an electrical ground back here as well. You want to make sure that once you're done with the job anyway, that is still in place. Very important to the operation of your car, believe it or not. Weave it around the oil supply line, and then there you go, comes out. Now you might be able to work around the compressor inlet, but honestly it's not really worth the effort. Pretty easy to take off, so I would take it off. 8mm socket on here on the constant torque constant tension that we use. The other bolts, by the way, 10mm, 10mm, 13mm for the wrench sizes you need. So sometimes your hose clamps can kind of adhere to the rubber. So same thing with removing the hose. Just give it a bit of a twist and you can usually get them loose that way. And actually, you know what? I don't know that I actually need to take that off. But I bet I need to take this off on this end instead. Just going to unplug this, get it out of our way altogether. A lot of zip ties on this car, so we'll work our way around some of those guys. So removing this will make it a bit easier to work, but even more so for the video. It's going to make it a lot easier to see things. So I would probably remove it even if you're not making a video. Okay, so we've got that off. We've got everything mostly cleared away. I'll probably get that completely out of the way in a sec for video purposes. So the inboard banjo here is most likely, this guy is most likely going to be pointing straight down to start off with. That's good. That's where we want it. So you shouldn't need to do anything with that. The outboard banjo is going to need to point up. So we'll take this guy off and we'll take the hose off of that one. Sometimes you might need to take the banjo off just for ease of use in there. It's a little tight. So if you need to, no problem. We include new crush washers for either side. If you do loosen it, make sure that you replace the crush washers on either side. So be careful when you're loosening this guy. When the bolt breaks loose, you don't want to kind of rip through the oil supply line. Okay, so we are going to reuse, you might have a little bit of spillage there. That's the way it works sometimes. So we are going to reuse the banjo bolt and the banjo fitting, but not the crush washers. Again, we're going to replace those. And I'm not going to worry about taking this off, the banjo fitting off of the hose yet, because I'm going to remove the hose altogether and I can take it off at that point. I'm going to get the inboard line off now. To start off with though, I'm going to detach the lines from this bracket here. We've got P-clamps holding it in place. Again, this is the kind of thing, if you're not running a Flyin Miata turbo kit, you may not have this. So if you are, 5mm Allen. And I have pre-drained that. I didn't show you guys, but once I got it off of here, I basically ran it down as low as possible with a bucket underneath it, and I got a fair amount more coolant out of it. So that would make a mess if you didn't do that ahead of time. All right, I'm going to take the P-clamp off of this hose because this one's still attached, and just one less thing to kind of be in the way down there. Ugh. So I'm going to take the hose clamp off of the inboard water line now. This is going to be kind of awkward. It's kind of hard to see. And it's probably going to be a challenge to pull the hose off once we've got it as well, but we'll give it a shot. Okay, so I've loosened that one all the way, basically as far as I can, because I'm anticipating a bit of a struggle. The hose barbs can be pretty tenacious. They're pretty aggressive with their serrations in there. So I'm just going to pull this straight down. That was actually surprisingly not terrible. So slipped right off. I don't know if you guys can hear it, but it's dribbling more coolant. So you're going to make a bit of a mess. In my experience, it is physically impossible to get all of the coolant out of an engine. So just part of the fun. All right, so now we have yet another zip tie. Actually, it looks like two. All right, so we'll clip this zip tie so that they're actually loose. And one of the turbo lines is attached right here. The other one is attached down here. So we're going to go ahead and pull both of those guys off. Okay, and since I failed to mention it, 7mm driver, one of these flexi guys, is highly recommended if you have one. Okay, a little more dribble. And then we'll pull this guy straight up. There we go. Oop. Lost my hose clamp. I'll go find that in a minute. Okay, weave it out, and there we go. We've got our water lines out. Okay, so I left this guy on because it would be kind of a pain to take off in the car. Now that it's easily accessible, I'll get it out because we are going to reuse the fitting. There we go. All right, so none of this stuff is going to get reused. It would probably be fine to reuse it. We include new parts just because. So step number one here is that we're going to replace the line that runs from the water neck to the water pump inlet. So that's from this guy down here to this guy. And that's where the water used to go in stock format. We interrupted that for the turbo supply. Now we're gonna put it back to stock basically. Now, if you have deleted the thermostat neck or water neck altogether, you're gonna need to run a line from this fitting here all the way over to the idle air control valve. Again, you can see this stock hose here, we're basically just duplicating that in one piece. So if you do that, you want to attach, and you'll have to kind of figure out the specifics, but really the short version is be absolutely certain that the hose is well clear of any of the belts and pulleys, because that will ruin your day pretty quickly, and a belt will go through a silicone hose, even a really nice one like what we use, in no time at all. So all that having been said, we're not doing that. We're just gonna put, again, kind of duplicate the stock setup. So we give you one long length of hose with the kit. So you're just gonna wanna cut it to length everywhere that you need. We're gonna connect these two pieces. This is a later car, it's 2001. So the diameter of these barbs is actually a little bit bigger. So it's a little bit more of a headache to get into place. What I would recommend for this, if you wanna put a little bit of lube on the barb, go for it. You don't necessarily need it, but it'll make your life a little bit easier. But what I'm gonna do is not put a hose clamp on yet. That'll allow me better grip on the hose, and then I'll slip a hose clamp down into place once it's in there. So slip it down, route it through your holder there, and then just kind of try to keep the hose straight and push it straight down. Okay, and make sure it's all the way down. That barb turns 90 degrees. So really you just need it down far enough so that you've got enough on the back side of that bead to put the hose clamp on. But if you push it all the way down to the 90, you'll be fine. So what I'm gonna do now is guesstimate on my length. Make sure your hose is kind of pushed in there. And again, err on the long side. We gave you plenty of hose, so don't worry about trying to be real conservative with it. So I'm gonna cut it about there, and again, leave it too long and trim to fit rather than vice versa. So yeah, I think that's gonna work pretty well. So I'm gonna slip this hose clamp down. Pay attention to where you want the drive on your hose clamp to end up so that you can actually get a wrench on it. I want this, the nut, the end of the bolt rather, to kind of point over here on the right side so that it is easy to access. So I'm gonna slip that in there. Got to kind of finagle it a little bit past this stuff. And that is down in place. So I'm going to put the second one on. And there you go. So tighten those up and we can call this portion of it done. Okay, so both of my hose clamps are tight. Now I was very careful to reuse this clip right here and kind of push it in a little bit to make absolutely certain that this hose is held well clear of both of the belts. Obviously, again, that would be a bad day if the hose ran into that. So we're gonna get everything set up for our water lines before we actually put our water lines in. First thing is to put this stud into this nut in the chassis right here. Little goofy, but it actually works really well. So we're gonna thread this down into place through there. And you wanna thread it down pretty far, basically until the threads are basically flush with the nut there. So that's gonna give us a little bit of thread on the bottom, and we're gonna thread this nut onto the bottom there, and that's gonna lock the stud in place. Okay, so just tighten this down and make sure that this stud doesn't spin as you're tightening that nut. And this is nothing that has to be crazy tight or anything. We're just trying to get this stud to be stationary. That's all. We've got that done. Now it's time for the water lines. Okay, so this is our heat sleeve. Pretty fancy stuff, works really, really well, long-lived, all that. We need to cut it into 4 sections. So there are 2 hoses, of course, in and out, and each hose needs to be protected from heat by the turbo and at the back of the engine. So we just need to cut it into 4 equal length sections. Pretty easy. Fold it in half, fold it in half again, and cut. It's not absolutely critical that you get them all exactly the same length. They should be about a foot, but this is plenty close enough. So we're gonna slip this onto here. Can be a bit of a tight fit. You basically wanna be really gentle, and you don't wanna squeeze the heat sleeve when it's on the hose. If I try to do this, I can't get it anywhere. If I kind of gently work it from the top, it works much better. So the more heat sleeve you get onto the hose, the more difficult it's gonna be to get it in place. Just kind of have to work it in there a little bit. And if you really have trouble with it, you know, this is far enough on that it should be fine. If you really have trouble with it, you can do a couple things. I'm holding it on the bottom so it can't move anywhere, and then I'm basically forcing it on the top. I've got it there. Now I'm holding it on the top, and I pull it down. So that works well. If you have a lot of trouble with it, just to start off with, you can use some Simple Green. But again, push it onto the hose as opposed to pulling it on while you're overlapping the hose. We're gonna slip the hose clamp on, and again, I'm gonna pay attention to the orientation. So I'm gonna start with the lower barb back there, and I can see that I don't really have access on the front of the barb, but I do have access on the back of the barb. So I'll put it on the top because it's easier to see, but we want it to be oriented like that. We do not want it to be oriented like that. So, and you've got to bear in mind that the bolt here is going to stick out, so you don't want it to poke into anything such as a heater hose. So regardless, we're going to put it on this way, slip it over both the hose and the heat sleeve, which is a little bit of a challenge, but definitely doable. And you can spin it if you want to kind of help. Make sure that you spin it clockwise. If you spin it counterclockwise, the hose barb will actually bite into the heat sleeve or hose and not move very easily. So, okay, we got that on. So now, again, full length hose. We're gonna route this, and we wanna route it from the bottom there. It's gonna come around through here, right past the stud that we just installed, under here, swing over, and then come back up to that hose barb. So you just kind of want to think about that as you're routing everything. So I'm going to route it underneath this, the oil supply, and then kind of back around in here. This is another place where different cars will vary based on how much stuff is back there. So same rules as the upper radiator hose. Just try to route it cleanly, no crimps, and make sure that it's not going to rub on anything sharp. And you can come back if there's unavoidable things. You can come back and zip tie it in place. You can use again, more scrap hose to kind of buffer things to make sure that everything is safe and clear, and it's going to be long-term reliable. Okay, you want to just keep pushing until it's all the way on. I can see that that's bottomed out on the brass there. So I'm going to rotate that hose clamp just a little bit because it will flatten out as it tightens. And then go ahead and tighten it down. Okay, so that's snug, that's secured in place. So now we're going to put our P-clamp here because that's what's going to hold that hose and make sure that it stays. So I've got my P-clamp. I'm going to slip it over the hose here and then over that stud. But first I'm going to kind of try to look at it and see, you can still manipulate it a bit once that hose clamp is in place, but I want to get it kind of close to start off with. So I'm going to slip that on there. No, pinch it closed first. That'll make life a little bit easier. Okay, and slip it on. And that looks pretty good. I'm not really too concerned about anything. That should be clear of the heat shield here. There's a little bit of contact right there, but that's a rounded edge, so it shouldn't do much. But I'll pay attention to that once we get it more in place. Drop the spacer in over that stud. The other line is going to go on top, but we're going to come back to that in a minute. So this thing is way too long. Again, we've got another hose to cut out of it, and we're pretty generous because there are a couple of different routings you can do here. So regardless, I'm going to route this to where it needs to go. I'm going to mark that spot. I'm going to pull it back out, cut it, slip a heat sleeve on, and then actually install it. Because even though you've got a lot of hose, you usually don't want to be too aggressive with cutting it short, because you don't have enough hose to do it over and over again. So I'm just going to run this through here. All right, and I can pull that up now. All right, so it's going to run about like that. It's going to connect to the banjo, of course. And again, once you've got it pretty close, cut it too long and then trim it back to length. So I'm going to cut it about there. Mark that spot with my finger. Okay, get that out of the way. And then I'm going to hold it a little more accurately in place and see if that's good. Long is, or can be, a bad thing, because if it's too long, it may hold it into places that you don't want it to be. But I think that's going to do us pretty well. All right, so I like that. Pull it off, slip our heat sleeve on. Again, gentle, don't try to rush it. Okay. There we go. Another hose clamp. And again, I'm going to orient it like that. Actually, no, I lied. I'm going to orient it like this so that it's outboard of the turbo a little bit and easier to access. Okay, and kind of pay attention to the natural curvature of the silicone. You know, you can fight against it a little bit, but if you don't have to, there's no reason. So it kind of sort of wants to lay like that. So I'm going to put it, kind of pre-orient it like that, and then I'm going to slip it down and push it onto that hose barb. Okay, it's pretty hard to see in there. You can use a flashlight if need be, but you can also kind of do it by feel, and you can feel that the end of the hose is all the way on there. So I will tighten that guy down and we'll move on to the other line. Okay, 3 days later, that's tight. So we're gonna run the other hose now. Same routine basically. One thing to bear in mind if you're not using this on an FM kit, it is very, very important that the lower barb on the reroute comes up from the bottom into the turbo, and then the other side again goes up and out of the turbo and then to the upper barb. So that kind of orientation of lower barb goes up into the turbo, upper barb comes up out of the turbo is very important for the thermal siphoning that happens. Water-cooled turbos are water-cooled so that when you shut the car off, the oil doesn't coke in there, and the thermal siphoning is what helps pull that heat away from the turbo itself. So it's really not, you don't really use a whole lot of water cooling in operation, but it is very important after you shut the car off. That's why we're not eliminating it altogether. So same routine. I'm going to slip the heat sleeve on and then put it onto the back of the head there. And again, paying attention to the orientation of my hose clamps here. Okay. And it kind of wants to curve like that a little bit. So I'm not going to try to fight against that. So I'm just going to spin this hose clamp all the way around until it's in the orientation I want. Because again, it spins clockwise pretty well. It does not spin counterclockwise, it'll snag. So I'm going to kind of try to, again, find the best routing I can. We've got our proportioning valve in a kind of unique place here. So I got to weave around that. I want to go underneath the oil supply line and then up in here. NAs will have a speedometer cable as well. So experiment, it's a little more dense. You want to experiment with different routing. Does it make sense for this one to go under and this one to go over? Do they both go under? It'll vary a little bit from car to car, but you can get there. I'm confident you can get there. Just kind of experiment with it to see what works best. That's tight. So I think that routing actually works pretty well. I may push the oil supply line, try to push it down a little bit so that it will be down below. Yeah, I think that's better right there. Okay. Yeah, that's better. Okay, so we've got it routed. We are not going to put the P-clamp on now. This one is pretty close to where it ends up. So the P-clamp's gonna go over the heat sleeve, and we don't wanna put the heat sleeve on until we've got it to length. Okay, so I'm gonna put the banjo bolt into the turbo. Remember your crush washers, same orientation, same order that they came off. So crush washer on the bolt, banjo fitting on the banjo bolt, crush washer on again. So the washers are sandwiching the fitting, and then let's thread it on. Again, we want it to point straight up, unlike, theoretically, presumably, how it came off. So, get that guy started. And I'll get it just hand tight for now. We'll tighten it down once it's actually done, but for right now, I just kind of want it hand tight so that it's held in place. Probably want to kick it a little bit towards the front of the car, because straight up would put it straight into the oil supply. You can reorient this if you want, but bear in mind you've got that slot in the heat shield, so you don't want to put it too far back because it's going to interfere with that. So if we orient it kind of like that, we should be able to have the hose come up here and then tuck back down in that direction. So I'm going to cut this guy to length. As I mentioned, we give you a lot of extra hose since you may be deleting the water neck, that kind of thing, and we'll kind of figure it out. So I'm going to guess that this is too long, but as I keep saying over and over again, better too long than too short. So I'm not going to put the heat sleeve on until I'm pretty confident of the length of the hose. So yeah, I want that just a little bit shorter because it comes up higher here than it really needs to. So I'll cut off a bit, say about that much. Okay, I like that. That's pretty good. That'll keep it from crimping. It'll keep it from coming up higher than is necessary. Should be able to pretty easily hold that clear of the oil supply line, so that looks good. I like that. So, you guys are probably used to this routine at this point, but let's put the heat sleeve on. This is a shorter hose, so, and actually, you know what? I'm gonna pull it out a little bit farther so I have a little more to play with. Okay, there we go. So I got the heat sleeve on. I pulled it back out from around this brake line, so I need to make sure to route it back there. Okay, and then kind of give everything a final once over just for general location. That looks good to me. I need to go underneath this. So I want to get the hose clamp on now. Again, pay attention to the orientation. That's where I want it to point. There's a little tab on there. Like I mentioned before, you can kind of see it now. Basically, if I spin it clockwise, it's going to snag. If I spin it counterclockwise, it will not snag. So that just depends. You know, here I need to spin it counterclockwise. Here I need to spin it clockwise. So got to tuck the heat sleeve underneath. Not a real big deal, but again, got to pay attention. Okay. All right, and then underneath the oil supply, and then push it down onto that hose barb for banjo fitting. I can tell that guy's all the way on, so we'll tighten them down. Okay, that's snug. So I'm gonna take the P-clamp, I'm gonna locate that right now. So again, kind of slip it over, pinch it shut, put that guy in place. And I'm pretty happy with that right there, actually. Quite happy with that. All right, so squish that down into place. This nut, you can see it has a bit of an angle on the top of it. This side needs to go on first. The last threads on this side are crushed, so that means that it's a lock nut and it'll stop spinning by hand when you get to here. It'll spin with a wrench, but you have to force it on. So you always have to start this way. So angled side goes up. A little awkward, a little tight, but doable. Okay, so we're gonna tighten up that banjo bolt. Just pay attention to its orientation. Again, you want it to angle a little bit towards the front there, but you don't really want it rubbing on anything. So I'm gonna try to keep it clear of the oil supply line and also the compressor housing. Snug is fine. You'll see I'm not using a giant wrench on here. That is a hollow bolt. You don't want to go crazy with the torque, but there you go. So plumbing wise, we are done. Basically, we just need to reassemble everything. This car has coil on plug right here. So the coils have basically been a non-issue for this whole install. Makes it a little bit easier. For the earlier cars, anything 90 through 2000, they have coils on the back of the engine. So now is the time when we would reinstall those. So as I mentioned earlier, the lower bolt here, really, I don't consider it particularly critical. If you don't want to put it back on, no problem. If you do want to put it back on, but you want to make it easier to get the coils on and off, you can slot the metal here so that it can just slide straight down onto this rubber grommet. Either way, if you retain this at all, you do need to use the new bolt and washer that we include. So this is the 20mm M8, and it's the bigger of the M8 washers. So that's going to go on there. Reason we need that is that the stock bolt is a little bit thicker. It's going to stick out a little bit farther, and it could interfere with your ECU temp sensor back there. Wanted to show you real quick on an NA. Since we're using an NB for the entire install, there are a couple of differences. One of them is the speedometer. So on an NB, it's an electronic, so wires, and there's nothing mechanical connected in there. On an NA, it's a little bit different. You've got a mechanical speedometer cable that runs there, so it runs kind of in the way. It's going to be pretty tight back in here. There's a little metal bracket that holds the cable. You're probably going to have to bend that up out of the way, and so you'll need to do that before you actually put this down into place, and it'll be a little bit of trial and error. Not a big deal, just something you need to do. Another place where it gets a little weird is with the turbo water lines. So on the NB that we're working on, we've got lots of room back here. Well, not lots of room, but more room. On the NA, we kind of have to weave the water lines around the speedometer cable. So you can see the speedometer cable is right here and right there. Kind of hard to see. But I've got the lower hose running underneath the cable, and I've got the upper hose running behind the cable here, and then above the cable there. And that seems to be the best routing for this. All right, so we'll put the coils in place now. Check back here first. Make sure that your wiring harness is kind of tucked out of the way. It's not going to get in the way of anything, so kind of push that back a little bit. Slip the coils back into place, and then tighten them down. All right, so we'll plug the coils back in. Make sure that you get the right plug on the right side here. They're kind of pre-formed, or they're formed at this point after so many years, so should be fairly straightforward. All right, and then we're gonna reconnect the plug wires. So the 1.8 firing order is 4, 1, 2, 3, so 4, 1, 2, 3. The 1.6 is 3, 2, 1, 4, so basically the opposite. And it's standard numbering protocol. Forward cylinder is number 1, so 1, 2, 3, 4. So 4, 1, 2, and 3. Push all those boots down, make sure they're nice and solid. So we've got the reroute all installed. Now it's time to fill the system, but in order to completely fill the system, we need to start the car, and I need to reinstall some remaining parts before we start the car, or to be able to start the car. So we need to put the intake back on, we need to put the brake booster back on. We already have the EGR on and tight, so we're good there, the EGR pipe that is. So we'll get started, get all that set up so we can start it. So we need to put the mass airflow sensor back in since this car still has a stock ECU. You can see there's an arrow on the side there. It is very important that that points in the direction of the airflow. So from the air filter into the turbo. If you put this in backwards, your car will be very grumpy and upset about things. So make sure you put it in properly. Fairly durable housing, not completely bulletproof though, so do be kind of gentle and careful with it. A little awkward to get it around here, but it'll go. So I'll just kind of twist that into a place where it's happy. It feels pretty good. Also, make sure this wire is running over it. If you run under it, it'll be too short. So we're gonna plug that guy in. I'm gonna plug this guy in. Here's our wastegate actuator hose that comes from the compressor housing. Very, very, very important that this is plugged in and it will not melt or get damaged at all. If that happens, you're gonna overboost, and that's a good way to blow up your engine. So we wanna be very careful with that guy. Push it all the way on and make sure that it's kind of over here. We don't want it to hang out like that because it's gonna burn a hole in it. So natural curve is holding it like that, should be good to go. All right, for these constant torque hose clamps, these 4 washers here, you wanna make sure that they bottom out on each other, but you don't wanna get them any tighter than that. So that's about good right there. If you can go tighter, but you'll strip it if that happens. So just snug. That's especially important on this one here with the mass airflow sensor. You can crush the plastic if you're a little overzealous, and there is no pressure pre-turbo. The post-turbo, all the lines are pressurized. Pre-turbo, they're not. So that's another important thing to bear in mind, that you don't have to go crazy. I will hook up the recirc hose for the bypass valve. And let's toss the air filter on. All right. This one is not a constant torque, but again, just snug. No reason to go crazy. Okay, we'll bolt the brake booster pipe back in here. So just kind of slip it into place, use the original bolts, pretty straightforward. All right, we're gonna slip the hoses back on, grab some pliers for those hose clamps. Other side here. All right, so I disconnected this hose and pop the throttle cable out. So let's reroute those. These little grommets can move around sometimes, so slip it back into the appropriate position. Okay. This car has a actually another vacuum line here. Not all of them do, but just clip everything back the way it was. Try to route everything cleanly so it's not on sharp edges. Push that all the way on there. All right, we should be good to go. I'm gonna leave the heat shield off for now in case we find any leaks, so we can investigate that. It's also going to make it a little bit easier to get to the bleeder, on the reroute in the back. So we're ready to fill it with coolant. I have pre-filled it most of the way, so we'll just kind of top it off on camera. Filling coolant is boring. Okay, so we really like to use this funnel here. Goes on in place of the radiator cap, so you can fill it up, and then it has a plunger so that you're not going to make a mess with all the coolant that's still in there. Really convenient setup. The part number for this guy is in our written instructions, so you can check it out there. So I've got that set up. I'm going to set up the bleeder hose on the bleed screw on the back of the reroute here. So I'll just slip that down into place. I'm going to have this little tin here so that the coolant can kind of pee into that. So I'm going to pre-clock it a little bit because the bleeder is tight right now. Yeah, push that hose on there. Here's a 1/4 inch wrench here. Break that guy loose. All right, and I just gave it one full turn to kind of, you probably don't need that much, but I'd rather have too much than too little. It is going to dribble a little bit back there, particularly when you take the hose off. Just have a paper towel ready, that's all. All right, so I'm going to fill it up. So I'm going to fill it about halfway, just so that there's a fair amount of coolant in here. You can see, again, this one's been pre-filled, so don't expect it to do this quite as quickly, but you can see the coolant coming up out of the bleeder. You're going to want to pump the upper hose here, and you can see some bubbles coming up. Not too many left now, and you can see how the level moves in the bleeder hose there too. Okay, so that looks pretty good. This car's probably good, but I'm going to go ahead and start it and make sure that we get as much air out as possible. When you're first bleeding this, it'll be a little while until you get coolant out of here, and it'll fill up, and then you get a bubble, fill up and bubble. So just kind of run a bit through there to make sure that you've got it as air-free as possible. You're not going to get it 100% air-free. It'll need a couple of drive cycles to kind of flush everything out, but you want to get it as close as possible to start off with. If you don't have one of these funnels, it's a good idea to get the front of the car up in the air and leave the rear down. Something like ramps is pretty easy, common thing in your home garage, and that'll help get the car at a bit of an angle to make your fill point the high point of the system, or as high as possible anyway. So I'm going to go ahead and start this guy up, make sure we don't have any leaks, and then we'll seal it up, but then we'll pressure test it. All right, so you can see that it kind of peed some coolant out right there, and there were no bubbles coming out of there. So that means we've got a good bleed. Again, it won't be quite as quick the first time you do it. We pre-bled this one a little bit. So I'm gonna tighten this down. Oop. And if you loosen it off a full turn like I did, you can actually just twist the rubber hose and then just snug it with your wrench. And again, there's still a little bit of coolant in there, so it's going to make a little bit of a mess, so just... All right. So I'll dab that up. Okay. I will properly dispose of that in a minute. All right, one of the other convenient things, I've got this filled halfway. I can just put a plunger in there, push it down relatively firmly, make sure it's good. Take this off. And there's a little bit of a leak there, but not much at all. If you have a pressure tester, now is a good time to pressure test it. You cannot pressure test it before filling it with coolant. It will leak, even though when you have coolant on there, it'll actually seal up well. So we've already pressure tested this system. A lot of home mechanics aren't gonna have it, so I'm not gonna worry about that, but it is a good idea if you can do that just to make sure that you're good. Pressurize it to whatever your cap says, usually going to be 16 PSI on our systems, and leave it for a little while, maybe half an hour, maybe an hour. See if the pressure comes down. Sometimes the tester itself can leak, so if you lose pressure, make sure that you know where it's coming from and make sure it's not a false positive. It's entirely possible that your system will be sealed up really well, but the tester itself won't be. So don't chase your tail if that's what's going on. But this one's good to go. We're all sealed up. So I'm just gonna put this cap back on and reinstall the heat shield, and then we are good to go. I've got it lined up pretty well there. So I will just kind of slip the washer down there, and then I can feed the bolt down through there. Okay. And I'll do that. I'm going to leave it loose for now so that I can kind of manipulate its position, and then I can come back and tighten it once everything is in place. Okay, so before I tighten it down, I'm just carefully looking at everything, making sure that I've got everything in place and it's not gonna rub on anything. So this hose is kinda close, but really not very. I've got a rubber piece to protect my oil supply line, so I can tell that everything's pretty well clear. So I can go ahead and tighten everything down now. Okay. So I've got that in place. I've got good clearance on everything. I am pretty happy with all of that right there. You do want to check after each drive cycle for the first, I don't know, 2, 3, 4. Make sure that you're full here. Obviously you want to make sure your overflow tank is full before you set off. And if anything, you can overfill it a little bit, because chances are it's going to suck some in as you drive. It's also a good idea to just check the bleeder a couple times. Make sure that it is full and you don't get any air out of there. Once you do that for the first few drive cycles, you're good to go. And that's it. So the kit is all installed. You should be running much cooler or not overheating now. So that's the install. If you have any questions about the install or the product, please give us a call, shoot us an email, leave a comment below. We'll get back to you as soon as possible. Be sure you're following us on all the social channels, Facebook, Instagram, YouTube, all that fun stuff. Thanks for watching, and we'll see you next time.